Hello everyone. Today we have reached the second week of Module 2 of Postmodern Art and Literature, Theory and Practice. And in this section, we are going to cover postmodern literature, and lecture third is on postmodern feminist fiction. So when we were detailing about postmodern fiction, we had a special reference of postmodern fiction because feminist fiction, because feminism becomes a very important uh, tool of dissent, and many marginalized theories developed from the feminist fiction. So, I, Dr. Purnima, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya, admitted to the privileges of Banaras Hindu University, is continuing with postmodern art and literature, theory and practice. And in lecture 3, we are going to cover postmodern feminist fiction. So, when we talk about feminist fiction, we are discussing the introduction to postmodern feminist fiction. So, what are the two key terms that are coming? First is postmodernism, and the second term is feminism. And how they are intersecting and how they are inter-reflecting or intertextually, we can see that most of the feminist texts also have postmodern touches, and postmodern novels, even by male authors, have the tendency to talk about or discuss feminism, or they bring out misogyny that is inherent in the society, as we see in Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift. So, misogyny in campus novels and feminism in various forms depict itself in postmodern literature. And when we talk about postmodern art, because we are always cross-referring to postmodern art, there also we will see the rise and emergence of feminist art. So how it is directly influencing postmodern literature is also our concern in this module. So postmodern feminism aims to deconstruct long-standing gender norms and dismantle the hierarchical power dynamics and entrenched within patriarchal societies. So societies are basically patriarchal, and how patriarchy works, it is embedded. So very subtle. It is not like in the postmodern times. Patriarchy in its very orthodox form or traditional forms may have vanished, but subtle forms of patriarchy have re-emerged in the postmodern times, and this has been the concern of most of the feminist authors. They have also talked about that how feminist ideology has merged with postmodern narratives. So women have, because they, after the suffragette movement and so many women coming out and talking about the right to body, their right to voice, their right to, and even right to authorship, because before postmodern age there was a long period of time when women authors were forgotten, or they would write with male pseudonyms, because writing with the female pseudonym was very difficult, and that's why George Eliot took a male pseudonym. So there is something that has to change, and female authors became more bold, more practical in their approach, and they came up with all sorts of women issues, and they came under the umbrella term of feminism. So this new wave or fourth wave of feminism was very strong in itself, because it was also pluralistic like the postmodern age. So it was also carrying various streams of feminism, and they were all merging together. So what does feminist postmodern fiction do? It critiques patriarchy. It also critiques capitalism, because women writers are also very aware of consumerism, commercialization, even commodity fetishism, and commodification of body. So body fetishism is also something that women authors are very aware of, and they are voicing it in their works. So, and then they're also talking about, because it is a post-colonial time. We have already discussed historically that postmodern world coincides with the post-colonial world. So it is also talking about the third world women. So they're also talking about African women, Asian women, and the marginalized women, the tribal women, the Dalit women. So all the women's perspective, they merge into postmodern fiction. And they also use, because they are the postmodern writers, so they are also using all the narrative techniques that are being used by the postmodern writers. So they are using magic realism, and they are using self-reflexivity, and they are also using multiple voices, multiple narrations. So all the techniques that emerged during the postmodern times were very well used by these feminist authors. And then it centers women's voices, especially those silenced in mainstream literary traditions, because women feel muted and they feel marginalized in a world that was basically dominated by men. We have also talked about the white male superior attitude. So somehow the men who were not white, they felt marginalized, the women felt marginalized. So in a supremacist society where some people think that they are higher than the others, women often feel that they have not got equal footing, or they have been marginalized on so many different levels. And they also talked about how they have to go through prepartum or postpartum depression. So all these new concerns that were emerging with working women, because because the dynamics of works changed, and women had to again they had to manage between their work life and their home life. So these also became the concerns of the new feminist writers. So, and then what happened with the rise of women authors, they also talked about gender. And when they discussed that gender is performative, or when they said that sex is fluid, they also broke the gender binaries. And by breaking the gender binaries, they also gave a new voice to the LGBTQ community, the lesbian, the bisexual, the transgender, the and the queer community. So this was lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and gay community. So this is something that is very relevant in today's lecture or today's module, because when we understand women's issues, we also are able to understand most of the issues of marginalized communities through the perspective of feminist authors. So we can take the example of the Handmaid's Tale, which we have discussed in the earlier lecture, where women are treated as surrogates, or they are slaves because they are made slaves for giving birth. Because giving birth is a very important aspect of life also, and is also taxing for women. So women have to go through a lot during the labor and after labor rearing the child. So they would like to delegate it to someone else, and they would want to be free. But who would be free from it? Naturally, the people who are well off, who are richer, or the bourgeois class would benefit from it. And what would happen to the proletariat woman? So that remains the question in the postmodern times. And this is what feminist fiction is trying to bring out. Similar is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison uses magic realism, and she uses a ghost story like narration to talk about the aftermath of slavery and how women are doubly deprived, because black women are more deprived than other women because they have gone through both slavery and marginalization because they are women. So these were the very important questions that Margaret Atwood raised in the Handmaid's Tale and Toni Morrison brought out in The Beloved. Now, coming to the historical context of postmodern feminism. So, the early waves of feminism, we have talked about, and we already know about the first wave, second wave feminism. So, when we reach towards the final stages, or we can say the most advanced stages of feminism, there are many things that come into question. So we have talked about the equal rights to vote. So suffragette movement happened, and women came out, and they said that we have equal rights like men. So very late it was that women in America, especially because we are talking so much about Americanocentrism, and we are talking about the dominance of America and the shift from Europocentrism to Americanocentrism. So we can see that America, though it is becoming a very powerful center, but still it is not giving equal rights to women. So women's concerns were very pertinent, and in the changing societies also, women were feeling that they are still facing new kinds of challenges, new kinds of deprivation, and like with the Me Too movement, women came out and they discussed that they're not safe in workplace. So creation of safe spaces was one prime concern that came out with the rise of the new wave of feminism. So it was related with second wave and third wave feminism, and it focused on securing legal rights for women and combating institutional sexism. So how we have discussed, like we talked about the campus novels. So misogyny is inherent in workplace. It is inherent there in academia. So in places which we think are more safe spaces and women are more powerful or women have more voice, in those places also women feel marginalized, or sometimes they feel overworked because they have to form a work life balance. So, postmodern feminism emerged in the latter half of the 20th century, which critiques the idea of a singular essential woman. So, a woman, this is what postmodernism is all about. It is about multiple perspectives, it is about plurality. So, women also cannot be seen as singular group of people. Women also have so many different kinds of lifestyles. They have different backgrounds, they have different cultural backgrounds, they have different economical backgrounds. So a woman who belongs to a rich or aristocratic class is actually more privileged than a woman who belongs to working class. So the two lives, though they are both women and they suffer, but yet their suffering cannot be equated. So we have to understand that some women are more marginalized than other women, and that's why African women writers became very prominent. Dalit women writers in India or tribal women writers across the globe became very prominent because they were the ones who were marginalized on so many different levels. So it became a part of the women experience and emphasizing the intersectionality of gender with other aspects of identity such as race, class, and sexuality. See how race and class and other aspects are mixing. So you can be deprived on the basis of race and class, and then with gender, your discrimination is double fold. That is what we are discussing when we are talking about postmodern feminist fiction. So postmodern feminist literature, they give their voice through linguistic subversion. What are the techniques that they are using? So they are using linguistic subversion. So they are not using, women feel inadequate to express themselves in the language that is predominantly male. And which is again, when we consider Derrida's deconstruction and we think about language and we think about the world as logocentric, there is a neologism coming. So women are giving their own terms, terminologies, they're developing their own ideas and belief systems, and they think that they should have their own language coding because they cannot speak or they cannot voice themselves in the language that is predominantly male. A simple example would be like we talk about a prime minister, or when we talk about various roles, the chairman. So they are basically addressed as male. So the language is also somehow patriarchal, and that's why women writers were subverting language. They were using it in a different way to highlight that women are also discriminated through language. Then there is a narrative fragmentation. This narrative fragmentation is also something that is part of postmodern literature as a whole, and this also shows the fragmentation of women's psyche, because women, the anxiety of the age, the kind of breaking up of this human psyche, and especially women's psyche, is again represented in feminist fiction. And then there is intertextuality. This is also something that is not only very a subsection of postmodern feminist fiction, but this is something that reflects in all the postmodern writers. They use fragmentation, intertextuality, because again, we have talked about that there is a lot of content, there is a lot of mass media influence. So naturally, the narrative copies the age that it is talking about. So intertextuality is something that represents itself in the times, and it reshapes gender discourse, because when we talk about the genders, we look about it as genders are also not now binary, but it's more like the umbrella representation of LGBTQ community. So it is multiple streams, multiple colors, they are merging into one. Then the important authors that we are going to talk about are Janet Winterson, Virginia Woolf. We all know about A Room of One's Own. So Virginia, and especially Judith Butler. So Virginia Woolf was talking about a room of one's own. She was talking about spaces, because most of the time we ignored the right to space of women. So a home became symbol. Like A Raisin in the Sun is all about buying a house by women, especially mama. The character of Lena Younger. So why these characters are looking for a home? Why these characters are looking for a room? Because room gives you privacy. Room gives you also an alternative time and space to work. Because working in a place which is encroached by too many people is very difficult. So all these authors considered this, and that's why they were using these new techniques. And then there was Angela Carter, who was also talking about including women. So she was talking about inclusion, and many of the women at that time were talking about inclusion of women in the workforce. And that's how we can create an equitable society where everyone is treated as equal. And half of the world population is women. So when women are deprived, then it leads to a generation of people who are suffering. So it was challenging traditional gender norms and celebrating the complexity of fluidity of gender. So gender is so, people can be so different. So when we look at men and women as only man and women are the two genders or the gender binary and they are different from each other, sometimes we fail to see that gender is performative, and men may have feminine qualities or feminine traits, and men can be good cooks or good dancer, like Mahesh Dattani talks about it in Dance Like a Man. So, and women, on the other hand, can have certain masculine traits. So when we make a very fixated gender binary, somehow or the other we are depriving the two genders in some form or the other. So when we talk about the key features of feminist postmodern fiction, then it has a lot of intertextuality. They cross-refer to the other texts. So there is the text reference, because what they are subverting, what they are talking about, those things are also important. So when you are narrating a text, like if you are talking about a mythology, you take up a character like Sita, or you take up a character like Draupadi, and you retell the myth from that character's perspective. So that text references are there. Circe, Medusa, all these characters, their stories have been retold. So there is a subversion also, because they have been seen as monsters. And many women have been portrayed as monsters in myths. But those women are actually victims of the patriarchal society, especially Medusa or Circe. So when we look at these retelling of myths, we see that women are voicing themselves by subverting this pre-existing patriarchal myths. So they are also rewriting the myths. They are telling the fairy tales. And fairy tales have also been questioned. And even the tales where women are waiting for a Prince Charming. So this is also creating a kind of in the mind of women that man is the rescuer and he will come and rescue them. So that kind of traditional romances or traditional fairy tales were also critiqued and questioned in the postmodern times. And it also challenges the historical narratives, and it challenges dominant versions of truth and authority, because what is true and who is authority. And we have already discussed that authority in any form can be dangerous, because anyone who has power may try to misuse or abuse power. So with excessive power, there's also this fear that power's center or the authority will dominate the marginalized groups. So again, the fragmented narrative structure, which is a predominant trait of all the postmodern authors, is there in feminist fiction. And it often abandons linear storytelling and reflects the disintegrated realities of women and marginalized lives. So women are marginalized, but other marginalized lives also intersect, and they are intertextually represented in the works of women authors. And this is what Chimamanda Adichie is talking about when she says that stop looking at me as an African woman writer and look at me as a more in a more comprehensive manner as an author. Because the moment you say a woman author, you are trying to marginalize the author, and you're not looking for the stylistic qualities of the author, but you're just looking at the author as a woman or a black woman. And then multiplicity of voices and polyphony. This is also a very important trait that emerged in the postmodern feminist fiction. And multiple voices, actually, it is there in all the postmodern authors, and perspectives also give voices to the marginalized people. And then perspective can vary. There can be no singular truth, and so these are being questioned, and that's why there are so many questions that arise from there. So multiple narrators or multiple perspectives are very important to postmodern women fiction, and especially the women from the marginalized communities. Then deconstruction of language, because the impact of Derrida is so strong that language again becomes very controversial, and how you use language. New nomenclatures were also coming up, like the people of queer community, they started referring to them as not he or she as pronoun, but they. So this is how grammatically also there was no gender representation of the third gender or the different gender, so the other gender. So somehow or the other, this voicing of the gender which was not done by other groups was done by feminist authors very strongly, that led to the rise of LGBTQ authors. So language is shown as unreliable, gendered, and political. So there is a politics. Their language is also very political. Till now, we were looking at language as something that is very equal for all, but it is not so. How we use language, it can be used in a very derogatory way. It can be used to stereotype. It can be used to label people, and all these perceptions were not lost by feminist authors. So it was focus on the body and embodiment. So the female body is a recurring theme. It is not only a recurring theme in the women fiction, it is also a recurring theme in men's fiction world, because we have discussed that how this body fetishism or obscenity has been shown in anti-war novels also. So this is something that remains in postmodern narratives, and women, when they talk about it, they are very clear in their mind that how we are treating the body of women, or how we are commodifying the body of women, that is also being critiqued and questioned in their works. So often female body is a recurring theme, and it is often politicized by male authors, and it has also become a site of resistance, because women authors are resisting the masculine society and the masculine gender norms. So, and then there were certain things that were not talked openly, they were not talked about openly till now. So topics like menstruation, motherhood, sexuality, and violence, they became very important. The topics that were till now a taboo, and people were not openly talking about these things, came out in mainstream. So when we talk about fiction and women fiction, we cannot unsee that how they are talking about the marginalized world. So it brings the lives of women of color. We have discussed it, like Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, or we have talked about Chimamanda Adichie. So it also talks about queer individuals and disabled women. So see, there is various kinds of marginalization within the community also. So all women are not same, and you cannot see them as a monolithic group or a more similar group. They are a very diverse group, and they are facing diversity of problems, and that again from the lower class women also. So the focus is also shifting for these women, and the focus and challenges of dominant narratives is shaped by white Western male-centric perspective, and women authors are questioning this white male perspective. And then it reclaims silenced or erased histories, because history is again questioned and critiqued, and they say that history is his story. So where is the women's story or her story in history? So they talk about the slavery, colonization, and how history was also written from the dominant group's perspective. So it was the history of the kings and monarchs and queens, and not the history of common man. And then also it was mostly the history of men and not of women. So there was migration, sexual abuse, and fiction, and that's why historical fiction developed as a theme. So it uses fiction to expose systemic injustice through personal stories. It recognizes multiple lived realities across cultures, geographies, identities, and it additionally rejects essential feminism. So, feminism, which was monolithic, which was singular, it is no longer the same, and is talking about the diverse group of women facing diverse types of problems. And it embraces diversity and intersectionality. And then personal trauma becomes a lens to view institutional violence. So violence can be institutionalized. How? Through war, racism, patriarchy, and we have already discussed it when we were talking about anti-war novels, Catch 22, etc. So themes like reproductive rights became very important, economic exploitation of women became very important, how they are underpaid or not equally paid in their jobs. These questions were coming up, and state violence were also talked about. And what happens during war? The women are the worst sufferers because they are raped and murdered during wars. So important texts that came up in the postmodern feminist fiction are The God of Small Things by Arundhati Ray, that talks about class and gender marginalization in society. Then Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri and Monica Ali's Brick Lane. So, feminist fiction often talks about refugee and migration narratives also. Most of the feminist authors that became very prominent were from diaspora groups who have migrated to other countries. So, diasporic writers and um, women writers who have migrated to other lands, their works became very prominent. So, feminist postmodern fiction highlights how displacement affects women differently. It focuses on domestic labor. So, it talks about cultural expectations, loss of autonomy in migration because women also lose in that. And then the postmodern structure, nonlinear plots, fragmented voice, reflects fractured identities of migrated women. And women straddling multiple cultures often experience identity crisis like other postmodern authors. And postmodern texts, they celebrate hybridity and mimicry are two important ingredients that are seen in migration writers. We're also showing its strain. Example, Jhumpla Lahiri is the namesake, where the main character, Nikolai Gogoi, gets his name from the author, uh, Gogoi, and his name is also Nikhil, that is also taken from Nikolai. So their parents give him a more Western sounding name because they somehow reject their own identity. So he's got between his identity of Indian heritage and American life. Then storytelling as survival. So women reclaim their voice through narration, memoir, metafiction, multilingual text. Example, Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. So she gives the metaphor of women as caged birds. So it is a semi-autobiographical account of Black girlhood, trauma, and resilience. And then we talk about again the refugee women in feminist postmodern fiction. So she suffers double marginalization, and she is a woman and a refugee. She is often portrayed as hyper visible in suffering, yet silenced in agency. So she is her suffering is shown, but she is not doing anything. So that lack of taking initiative are there in women characters. Then feminist postmodern fiction gives voice to her struggle, survival, and resistance. And it subverts Orientalist and victimized portrayals with complexity and depth. And it often tries to reclaim storytelling as survival and identity making. So we can take the example of Monica Ali's Brick Lane, which explores the complexities of identity and belonging, blending East and West and highlighting the fluidity of cultural and personal identity. So it takes the protagonist Nazneen, whose life challenges traditional roles and societal expectations, and her journey subverts conventional gender and cultural narratives as she redefines her own identity outside the constraints of her arranged marriage and cultural norms. And then again, we have discussed a lot about Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So it is using all the techniques of postmodernism. That's why it is a seminal text. It is using dystopia, and it is also a postmodern critique. And it depicts a dystopian regime where women are reduced to reproductive roles. It critiques patriarchal and religious authoritarianism. And a quote from the novel describes the dystopian world: better never means better for everyone. So better for some people, but it is not better for everyone. So some people will always be marginalized in the society, and it always means worse for some. So this is something that is very difficult for women in the postmodern times. It also talks about surveillance and control, and how women, particularly handmaids, are constantly monitored and controlled by the state, limiting their autonomy. And then there is this religious justification of patriarchy through the regime, which uses religious ideologies to justify the oppressive laws and patriarchal structure. And then there is this loss of identity, as we see in the character of Offred, who is no longer a person, but a, she is off Fred, she is the slave of Mr. Fred. So, and then it is a narrative as resistance. The protagonist of Fred tells her stories as an act of survival. Her fragmented subjective narration reclaims agency in a world that denies her identity. And then again, work that I have taken as an example is Difficult Daughters by Manju Kapoor. And again, this follows a non-linear narrative and in an Indian context, and it moves from past and present. So it is how it is using time and space, and it is using memory devices that is also used by postmodern authors like Rushdie. And it is blending memories and personal histories. It is also talking about female agency and how Viramati asserts her right to education and love, challenging patriarchal norms. And it talks about marriage and independence, and Viramati's struggles reflect the tension between personal freedom and societal expectations. So women who want any say in the society are often seen as difficult women or difficult daughters. And then it interrogates the tradition and challenges the sanctity of marriage and the duties of womanhood in traditional Indian society. And then personal meets political, and the partition backdrop mirrors inner conflict and identity crisis. And then there is the self-reflective narration, where the daughter's narrative reflects on her mother's choices, adding a postmodern layer of introspection. Thank you. That's all for today.